Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Premier Injuries Daily Roundup. Game week 15 is done, and I'm speaking ahead of the round 16 fixtures this weekend, the final set before the World Cup break. But before then, we have an almost full slate of Carabao Cup fixtures, so we'd advise that any transfers be held off until the last moment because there will be injuries, there always is, and also there's a possibility of the odd suspension that can be picked up. What I would say for those playing FPL, don't forget, you did receive or you have received an extra wild card this season. That additional wild card can be used during that World Cup break. So if you still have one, haven't used it during these first 15 game weeks so far, you can treat this weekend as a bit of a free hit. So get that busted. And maybe you can follow some of our tips for our differential Dinnery tips that will go live with 888 later on in the week. But back to the injuries, and we'll start off with Heung-min Son. There's a lot of talk since he fractured his left eye socket on whether he'd be available for the World Cup. Now, the Korean Football Association have released a statement. They said that they've spoken to Tottenham Hotspur. The club said he's successful to repair that orbital fracture has went really, really well. Or they refused at this point to confirm whether he would be ready for those finals. Adding on to that, Antonio Conte said that he had messaged Heung-min Son, and he said he's very, very confident of the player returning. However, the actions of the player, he said that he was very down, seems to indicate that maybe the player isn't quite so sure. In terms of those types of return to play around those injuries, in recent times, of course, Kevin De Bruyne picked up, I think it was maybe back in 2020 or 2021, sorry, in the Champions League final. That was a broken nose and again, a fractured orbital socket on his left eye. He did undergo surgery and he was available for the Euros. In fact, he scored on his return for Belgium against Denmark. And that was a game they won 2-1. And that was after 19 days. Now, we're not saying this is like for like, but we are saying that it is possible for Heung-min Son, dependent, of course, on the extent of that injury. And of course, Kevin De Bruyne did not actually wear any kind of face mask, any facial protection. He just carried on. So fingers crossed that Heung-min Son is cleared for those World Cup finals in Qatar. One player who definitely won't be there, and that's Aston Villa midfielder Philippe Coutinho. He was absent from the matchday squad in the win over Manchester United. Unai Emery confirms that the Brazilian suffered a thigh problem in training. Now, there's a little bit, there's no definitive timeline on a possible return to play, but suffice to say, we're looking at a minimum of 6 weeks, according to initial reports, potentially going beyond 2 months. So it sounds as if it's a pretty nasty one. And like I say, he certainly doesn't look as if he's going to be involved. For Everton, Frank Lampard, disappointing result at home to Leicester City at Goodison Park on Saturday evening. The Toffees were forced into 3 enforced substitution. The first one, we've seen Idrissa Gueye go down early in that first half, had a little bit of treatment on the top of his right thigh on that quadriceps muscle, replaced at the break. Lampard is fairly hopeful and optimistic that it isn't too serious, given the fact that he was able to continue for the remainder of that half. He's been sent for a scan on Monday, so we should know more. Also, DCL, this latest setback, what Lampard referred to as a sensation in his hamstring. He doesn't think it's a serious problem, but you know, the fact that it's another red flag and a guy who was really up against it in terms of trying to force his way into Gareth Southgate's squad probably means that he isn't really in consideration now. And truth be told, he's a big doubt for the next 2. So that's a hamstring issue again that needs to be checked. Now, Amadou Onana, he's the 3rd player that's forced off. That was an ankle problem. He went into the game with a slight ankle issue, a little bit of a strain in there. Had a couple of kicks, took a knock, so went off early in that second half. I think it was around about that hour mark. That allowed Doucouré to come back in the team. He does have a little bit of strength and depth in that department, Frank Lampard. But of the 3, I would say Onana is best placed to be cleared for the final weekend. Go down to Mayboy's fantastic result on the South Coast. Gareth Southgate took that opportunity to cast his eyes over Kieran Trippier and Callum Wilson once again. Of course, he was at St James's Park last weekend for the 4-0 win over Villa. Callum Wilson came off at half-time. Eddie Howe spoke. He said it was a joint decision between the staff and Wilson. Wilson didn't feel he had the energy levels to go up and cause any problems for Southampton. Of course, we know that he went into the game with a slight fever, hadn't been feeling great, hadn't been training fully. So it was related to that, a little bit of dizziness, a little bit of lightheadedness. So nothing to worry about in terms of injury. However, there were concerns with regards to Kieran Trippier. He looked as if he had a hamstring issue towards the end of that first half, stretched it off during that halftime break, returned for the second 45 and came through that without any major problems. So he's come out and he's confirmed and allayed any worries that he's a potential injury doubt by saying he's absolutely fine. So no worries there. For West Ham and David Moyes took a little bit of flack during the defeat, home defeat that is, to Crystal Palace. Side Ben Rama was replaced in the second half, again around about that hour mark. So home support weren't impressed. A lot of boos going around that. However, David Moyes insists that it was enforced. Ben Rama went into the game rated as touch and go, a doubt after picking up a knee injury, and his knee was actually heavily bandaged. Now, David Moyes said you wouldn't have seen that because the player pulls his socks up so high, but it was bandaged, it was supported, and he wasn't moving freely. So that's why David Moyes did actually make that enforced substitution. A lot of suspensions, just to add before I forget, with regards to players picking up their fifth caution of the campaign. Go on to the premierinjuries.com website to find out who they are. There's a couple there from Fulham, Tete, Harrison Reed, also Bournemouth with Chris Meppen. Like I say, with those midweek fixtures as well, yellow cards will count. For those wondering when this 5 yellow card cut-off happens, it's at the halfway point of the season. So once those games have concluded and game week 19, so that's in and around that festive fixture programme. For Southampton, we know that Ralph Hasenhüttl, the defeat at home to Newcastle at St Mary's on Sunday, cost the Saints boss his job. So he's now gone. But Larius was a player who he brought in for his final team selection. He was forced off in and around that 34th minute with an adductor problem. He also brought in Theo Walcott, man out the cold for the first time. I think his first start maybe since Boxing Day in the Premier League last year. Obviously did not work out. Liverpool 2-1 winners at Tottenham, came through the game unscathed, no fresh injury concerns. However, in the build-up, we did become aware of another setback for Naby Keita. Naby Keita hasn't featured at all for Liverpool this season. He was named on the bench against Crystal Palace in game week 2, but he's yet to play a minute, and that's a hamstring problem. Now, when will he be back? We just don't know. Naby Keita has only played a quarter of all Premier League minutes since joining Liverpool, and it looks to be a disastrous final year of his contract. It remains to be seen whether he's offered a new deal. For Leeds, their great come from behind win against Bournemouth at the weekend, but Jess Marsh's side was without Patrick Bamford. The injury-prone, injury-hampered attacker suffered another setback during the final session. This time, the US coach referenced it as a hip issue that he picked up taking penalties in the last knock-ins of Friday's session. Doesn't think it's too serious, gives him an outside chance of returning in game week 16, but I would fully expect Rodrigo to lead that Leeds attack. And finally, Erling Haaland wasn't quite fit enough to start the game against Fulham. Pep Guardiola said that it would depend on the circumstances in and around the game whether the striker come on, following the dismissal of Joao Cancelo. Of course, Haaland was reduced at 1-1. He had a goal disallowed. Slight it was an offside, but then also converted a penalty deep into time added on. Now, in his post-match interview, he said that it was one of the most nervous moments of his life. Yeah, and who would have thought that a Manchester City home fixture against Fulham would be the so. But there you go. So in terms of his injury, he came through that really well. That was a foot problem. So going forward, I wouldn't expect him to be risked in the Carabao Cup, but certainly I think he's going to be back in the groove for game week 16. Although Alvarez as well was another great option. Looked sharp, looked bright, and got himself another goal. So that's it for now in terms of your roundup from game week 15. If there is any major breaking news from those Carabao Cup previews, of course, You can always follow our social medias at Ben Dinnery or the premierinjuries.com table. And of course, we will be doing another video update. So any comments, pop them in the box below. Otherwise, we see you again very soon.